In November 1932, the Australian military launched an operation that would become one of the most embarrassing military failures in modern history. Armed with Lewis guns, thousands of rounds of ammunition, and the full backing of the Australian government, soldiers marched into the Western Australian outback with a single mission: to eliminate emus. These large, flightless birds had become a nuisance to farmers, and the government decided that military force was the appropriate response. What followed was not a decisive victory, but a humiliating defeat. The emus, through a combination of speed, tactical evasion, and sheer numbers, outmaneuvered the Australian military. Soldiers returned empty-handed, their ammunition depleted, their mission a failure. The press had a field day. Headlines mocked the Australian Defence Force for losing a war to birds. The incident became known as the Great Emu War, and it remains one of the strangest military engagements ever recorded. But this was not merely a comedic footnote in history. It exposed the desperation of struggling farmers, the limitations of military solutions to environmental problems, and the absurdity of bureaucratic decision-making. The Great Emu War was a collision between human arrogance and nature's indifference. And nature won. In this video, we shall shine the light on one of the most bizarre military operations in Australian history, and how a nation's soldiers were defeated not by an enemy army, but by 20,000 flightless birds. This is the story of hubris, failure, and the day Australia went to war with emus. To understand how Australia ended up declaring war on its own wildlife, one must first understand the context of post-war rural Australia and the ecological disruption that followed World War I. The Great Emu War did not emerge from nowhere. It was the result of economic desperation, environmental imbalance, and government incompetence colliding in the wheat fields of Western Australia. After World War I, the Australian government encouraged returning soldiers to settle in rural areas and become farmers. Thousands of veterans were given land in Western Australia as part of a soldier settlement scheme. The promise was simple: clear the land, plant wheat, and build a prosperous life. The reality was far harsher. The land was difficult to cultivate, the climate unpredictable, and the global economic downturn of the early 1930s sent wheat prices plummeting. Farmers who had invested everything found themselves struggling to survive. Then came the emus. Emus are large, flightless birds native to Australia. They can stand over 6 feet tall, run at speeds exceeding 30 miles per hour, and travel vast distances in search of food and water. Every year, emus migrated inland from the coastal regions of Western Australia to breed. In 1932, an estimated 20,000 emus descended on the farmlands of the Campion and Walgoolan districts. They trampled crops, destroyed fences, and consumed vast quantities of wheat. For farmers already on the brink of financial ruin, the emu invasion was catastrophic. Desperate, the farmers appealed to the government for help. They argued that the emus were not just pests, but a threat to the entire agricultural economy of the region. They demanded action. The government, under pressure and with limited options, made a decision that would later be regarded as one of the most absurd in Australian political history. Instead of deploying pest control experts or offering subsidies to repair fences, they decided to send in the military. The logic, such as it was, seemed straightforward. Emus were numerous, destructive, and concentrated in a specific area. The military had guns, ammunition, and trained personnel. A quick operation, they reasoned, would solve the problem efficiently. What they failed to anticipate was that emus, unlike human adversaries, do not follow predictable patterns of engagement. They do not mass in formations, they do not retreat in an orderly fashion, and they certainly do not surrender. In late October 1932, the Australian government authorized military intervention. Major G.P.W. Meredith of the Royal Australian Artillery was placed in command of the operation. He was provided with 2 soldiers, 2 Lewis guns, and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. The plan was to systematically eliminate the emus, reducing their numbers to a manageable level. On paper, it was a logical military operation. In practice, it was a disaster waiting to happen. The The military campaign began on November 2, 1932. Major Meredith and his small unit arrived in the Campion district, ready to engage the enemy. The farmers, hopeful that their problems would soon be over, guided the soldiers to areas where emus were known to gather. The first encounters did not go as planned. Emus, it turned out, were not easy targets. They moved in scattered groups, making it difficult to concentrate fire. When the soldiers attempted to engage them, the birds would disperse rapidly, running in unpredictable directions at high speed. The Lewis guns, designed for sustained fire against static or slow-moving targets, were ineffective against fast, erratically moving wildlife. Soldiers found themselves firing into empty fields, as emus simply outran the bullets. One early attempt involved waiting for a large group of emus to gather near a dam. The soldiers set up their guns and prepared to fire. As they opened up, the emus scattered in all directions. The soldiers managed to kill only a handful before the rest vanished into the bush. The operation was inefficient, costly, and deeply frustrating. Major Meredith quickly realized that conventional military tactics were useless against emus. The birds had no command structure, no supply lines, and no morale to break. They simply existed, ate, and moved on. Attempts to ambush them failed because emus were naturally wary and would flee at the first sign of danger. Attempts to herd them into kill zones failed because emus did not herd. They moved independently, making coordinated attacks impossible. Despite these setbacks, the operation continued. The soldiers moved from location to location following reports of emu sightings. They fired thousands of rounds, but the casualty count remained embarrassingly low. Estimates suggest that in the first week, only a few hundred emus were killed, despite expending thousands of rounds of ammunition. The emus, meanwhile, continued their migration largely unaffected. The press, which had been following the operation with growing amusement, began to publish mocking reports. Journalists described the emus as tactical geniuses and questioned the competence of the military. One reporter quipped that the emus had appointed a commander-in-chief who was outmaneuvering the Australian Defence Force. The phrase Great Emu War was coined, and it stuck. By mid-November, the operation was called off. Major Meredith withdrew his forces, having failed to achieve any meaningful reduction in the emu population. The government, embarrassed by the public ridicule, quietly ended the campaign. The emus had won, but the farmers were still suffering. The emus remained, and the damage to crops continued. In desperation, the government authorized a second operation in mid-November. This time, the military was more cautious, attempting to use vehicles to pursue the emus and fire on the move. The results were marginally better, but still far from successful. Over the course of several weeks, the military claimed to have killed around 1,000 emus, though independent estimates suggested the number was lower. Regardless, it was nowhere near the 20,000 that had invaded the farmlands. By early December, the second operation was also called off. The military had expended over 10,000 rounds of ammunition, spent considerable public funds, and achieved virtually nothing. The emus continued to roam the farmlands, and the farmers were no better off than before. The Great Emu War had ended, and the emus had emerged victorious. The Great Emu War became controversial not because of the conflict itself, but because of what it represented: a spectacular failure of judgment, planning, and execution. At its core, the controversy lay in the decision to use military force against a wildlife management problem. The government's choice to deploy soldiers and machine guns against birds revealed a profound misunderstanding of both the problem and the tools available to address it. The most immediate source of controversy was the sheer absurdity of the operation. Military campaigns are designed to achieve strategic objectives through organized force. Emus, however, were not an organized enemy. They had no leaders, no supply chains, and no strategic objectives. Treating them as a military target was fundamentally flawed from the outset. The decision to do so suggested either desperation or incompetence, and likely both. The operation also highlighted the plight of rural farmers, who had been abandoned by a government more interested in symbolic gestures than effective solutions. The farmers needed financial support, pest control assistance, and infrastructure improvements. Instead, they received a publicity stunt that failed to address the underlying issues. The Great Emu War became a symbol of government neglect and the disconnect between urban policymakers and rural realities. Economically, the operation was wasteful. Thousands of rounds of ammunition were expended, military personnel were deployed, and vehicles and equipment were used, all at public expense. The return on this investment was negligible. A few hundred, perhaps 1,000 emus were killed, but the population remained largely intact. Alternative solutions, such as building better fences or offering bounties for emu culling, would have been far more cost-effective. The press had a field day. Newspapers across Australia and internationally published satirical cartoons and articles mocking the military's failure. The image of heavily armed soldiers being outwitted by flightless birds became a source of national embarrassment. The Australian government, already struggling with economic and political challenges, found itself ridiculed on the world stage. Ecologically, the operation raised questions about humanity's relationship with nature. The emus were not invaders. They were native animals following ancient migration patterns. The true problem was human encroachment on their habitat. Farmers had settled in areas where emus had roamed for millennia, and then demanded that the government eliminate the birds for inconveniencing them. The Great Emu War exposed the arrogance of assuming that nature could be easily controlled or eliminated when it conflicted with human interests. Finally, the scandal lay in the government's refusal to acknowledge failure openly. Instead of admitting that the military approach had been misguided, officials quietly ended the operation and moved on. There was no formal apology to the farmers, no acknowledgement of wasted resources, and no serious effort to implement alternative solutions. The Great Emu War was swept under the rug, remembered only as a bizarre historical curiosity rather than a lesson in failed governance. The consequences of the Great Emu War extended beyond the immediate failure of the military operation, shaping public perception, government policy, and the legacy of one of Australia's strangest episodes. At its core, the failed campaign had profound implications for the farmers, the military, and the broader relationship between government and rural communities. For the farmers of Western Australia, the consequences were devastating. The emus continued to destroy crops, and the financial losses mounted. The government's failed intervention left them feeling abandoned and betrayed. Many farmers were forced to abandon their land, unable to sustain themselves in the face of economic hardship and relentless emu invasions. The Great Emu War became a symbol of government incompetence and indifference to rural suffering. For the Australian military, the operation was deeply embarrassing. The idea that trained soldiers armed with machine guns could be defeated by birds was humiliating. The press coverage damaged the reputation of the Defense Force, and the incident became a source of mockery for years. Soldiers who participated in the operation were reluctant to discuss it, and Major Meredith reportedly avoided speaking about the campaign in detail. The Great Emu War became a cautionary tale about the limits of military solutions to non-military problems. Politically, the failure forced the government to reconsider its approach. Instead of deploying soldiers, authorities eventually introduced a bounty system, paying farmers for every emu they killed. This proved far more effective. Over the following decades, thousands of emus were culled through bounties, reducing their impact on farmlands. The lesson was clear: targeted, localized solutions were more effective than grand military gestures. The Great Emu War also had broader ecological implications. It highlighted the challenges of human-wildlife conflict in a country where vast stretches of land were shared between agriculture and native species. The emus were not the problem. The problem was poor land management, inadequate infrastructure, and a lack of understanding of natural migration patterns. The failed campaign underscored the need for sustainable approaches to coexistence rather than attempts to dominate or eliminate wildlife. Culturally, the Great Emu War became embedded in Australian folklore. It was retold in books, documentaries, and popular media as a humorous but cautionary tale. The story resonated because it captured a fundamental truth. Nature does not yield to human arrogance. The emus, indifferent to military strategy and political posturing, simply continued their migration, oblivious to the chaos they had caused. In this sense, the consequences of the Great Emu War were not just immediate, but enduring. It became a symbol of government failure, military overreach, and the futility of trying to impose human will on the natural world. And the emus, victorious and unbothered, continued to roam the Australian outback, as they always had. The legacy of the Great Emu War is one of absurdity, failure, and unexpected wisdom. What began as a government attempt to solve an agricultural problem became one of the most infamous military failures in history, remembered not for its strategic importance, but for its sheer ridiculousness. Yet beneath the humor lies a deeper legacy, one that speaks to the limits of human control, the consequences of poor planning, and the resilience of nature. At the most immediate level, the Great Emu War left a legacy of embarrassment. It became a permanent fixture in the annals of military history as the campaign where Australia lost to birds. The story has been retold countless times in books, articles, and documentaries, often with a tone of disbelief. How could a modern military, equipped with machine guns and trained soldiers, fail so spectacularly against flightless birds? The answer lay not in the incompetence of the soldiers, but in the fundamental misunderstanding of the problem. The emus were not an enemy to be defeated, they were a natural phenomenon to be managed. The failed campaign also left a legacy of distrust between rural communities and the government. Farmers who had appealed for help watched as the military fumbled the operation and then withdrew, leaving them no better off than before. The Great Emu War became a symbol of government detachment from rural realities, a reminder that policymakers in distant cities often failed to grasp the challenges faced by those on the land. Ecologically, the legacy of the Great Emu War is more nuanced. It highlighted the ongoing tension between human activity and wildlife in Australia. The emus were not invaders. They were native animals following ancient migration routes. The conflict arose because humans had settled in their path and expected nature to accommodate them. The failed military campaign underscored the futility of trying to dominate the natural world through brute force. Instead, it pointed toward the need for coexistence, better land management, and sustainable agricultural practices. Culturally, the Great Emu War has become a beloved piece of Australian folklore. It is remembered with a mixture of humor and national self-awareness. Australians have embraced the story, turning it into a symbol of humility and resilience. The ability to laugh at one's own failures is a form of strength, and the Great Emu War has become a reminder that even the most well-intentioned plans can go hilariously wrong. Finally, the legacy of the Great Emu War extends beyond Australia. It has become a global symbol of the unintended consequences of hubris. The story resonates because it captures a universal truth. Nature does not care about human plans, strategies, or ambitions. The emus did not set out to humiliate the Australian military. They simply continued doing what emus do: eating, migrating, and surviving. In doing so, they exposed the limits of human control and the absurdity of trying to impose order on the natural world through violence. In the end, the Great Emu War was not a war at all. It was a lesson in humility, in the importance of understanding problems before attempting to solve them, and in the resilience of nature. The emus won not because they were stronger or smarter, but because they were unbothered. And perhaps that is the most enduring legacy of all. The reminder that sometimes the best strategy is simply to keep moving forward, no matter what the world throws at you.